So Greg is a fellow and managing director at the Engelberg Center here at Brookings. He leads all of our efforts related to innovation, biomedical sciences, of which this is a critical component, but only one component. And you're going to hear from him and some really distinguished leaders about a topic that we've already started today, how we can start building this long-term system with some initial steps. But as you'll hear, there are a lot of efforts already underway that can potentially fit very well with this one. So I'll turn it over to Greg while the panel is coming on up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Mark. The Planning Board report outlines the future of the medical device system, the NDS, as part of a larger national health information infrastructure. We heard that theme throughout all of the panels, that this system should not be built from scratch as a standalone system, that it does need to incorporate all of the lessons learned and relevant capabilities of other existing systems that are producing medical evidence across the United States. In addition, the Planning Board felt that starting off with a 2-year incubator project that would be geared toward answering critical, important questions that could help inform the more complete MDS implementation plan, as well as do some early feasibility pilot studies that might help answer some of those questions and begin to lay the infrastructure framework for the foundation. This session is intended to start the conversation on how can we leverage current efforts, what are the next feasible steps to actually building toward that national system. We've asked many of the leaders from these existing programs to be part of this panel to discuss how to start partnering and to create the foundation for the MDS long-term system. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists in the order that they'll be speaking. Mitch Krukoff is Professor of Medicine and Cardiology at Duke University Medical Center and Director of Cardiovascular Devices Unit at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Richard Platt is Professor and Chair at the Department of Population Medicine, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. Carmela Bacino is Executive Vice President of Clinical Affairs and Strategic Planning at America's Health Insurance Plans. Joe Selby is the Executive Director of PCORI. And finally, Sally Oken is Vice President for Advocacy, Policy, and Patient Safety at Patients Like Me. Before we begin with go ahead, Mitch, I'm sorry. Do you want to kick off the presentation? I know you've been coming from. I know you've been heavily involved with a lot of MD EpiNet meetings to date, and I know a lot of the efforts that MD EpiNet has been doing in terms of pilots and methods are very related to building that infrastructure for the system.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you, Greg. And it's actually very exciting to be in the room, although in the morning I've been across town at the CRT meeting, so I apologize if anything I say is redundant. I think as I looked at this part of the program, though, the word leveraging, I think, is worth exploring, in that on the one hand, it implies that we're leveraging things because something we already have is incomplete. So obviously we don't have a medical device system in place right now. We don't have an infrastructure that would support such a system right now. Our traditional device evaluation is very segmented and fragmented and, most importantly, redundant. And that tends to do two things. It makes safety information harder to evaluate when we do it in pieces because the real safety events are rare. And the redundancy is what adds cost and time, which is something nobody wants. So the other side of leveraging is that it also intimates a sort of opportunity and an openness and an opportunity that through collaboration we could do better than we're doing right now. And I think there was an African proverb shared with us last week that applies here: to go fast, go alone. To go far, go together. And frankly, as a practitioner, I'm an interventional cardiologist, and I like to have medical devices for my patients, and I have family who are patients. I think we need to do some of both. We need to go fast, but we also really need to go far. And for the national system, I think the opportunity to strategically link systems that already exist, without any question, could yield better than we have right now. Longer term, I think more seamless systems and more seamless tools can evolve. And again, doing both, to me, seems to be the sort of center of at least our focus. And since my boss of 27 years is about to become Jeff's boss, maybe we can even talk the same language. I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of the ways we talk about this start with some very high level, what we call essential principles. So if you're going to link data, if you're going to guard data, if you're going to understand the quality of data, these are principles that apply to all medical devices. But at the end of the day, if you're going to use those principles, we have to get them down into more general categories because, frankly, what we need and what we need followed up in an OBGYN device environment is different than a cardiovascular environment or an orthopedics environment. And even within general treatment areas, within cardiovascular, what we need from a coronary stent or an aortic valve or a defibrillator are different still. So we have to have some way to not only advance this general sort of holistic approach in novel terms, but also to bring it down to the actual devilish details that are required to be successful with regard to these medical devices and their evaluation. And in parallel with that, we need to build something that, frankly, in my opinion, we don't have yet, which is an environment that cultivates this kind of collaboration. We traditionally have worked in different silos. Stakeholders do their thing, so manufacturers do their thing, patients have their space, regulators, payers, et cetera. We need to cultivate actively an environment that creates a consensus about where this system goes. And I think the planning board has certainly been a step toward that end. And I guess I see my role here today because the MD EpiNet program has also moved over 3 years of being funded out of the epidemiology branch and the NITSA's efforts to bring forward the methodology center. You heard from Sharon Lees at Harvard and the infrastructure center under Art Sadrakian at Cornell. We have moved now to the establishment of a sustainable public-private partnership in MD EpiNet, and that's where we got our role specifically to bring forward an environment that could cultivate consensus, not from individual stakeholders, but as the ecosystem that device evaluation really is. So the public-private partnership shift for MD EpiNet really connotes two changes in composition and focus. One is the shift from specific stakeholder-granted funded projects to an ecosystem approach. This is where the emphasis on pre-competitive collaboration, experience, expertise, this is where alignment with efforts and priorities like the FDA's priorities for better clinical trials, for a clearer way of balancing pre- and post-market requirements. This is where the planning board, which Brookings has orchestrated so fabulously, and the MD EpiNet's National Medical Device Registry Task Force, which we are deliberately coordinating to align our efforts, to build on each other's ideas and not be going back and forth. The second big compositional and shift in, I think, MD EpiNet in moving to a public-private partnership is also in the recognition that traditionally and even today, a lot of the emphasis we're talking about is in the post-market environment. But as somebody who was around when the total product life cycle was first put forward conceptually by FDA, we have to recognize that no one piece of the TPLC works by itself. The stronger any one piece is, the stronger the other pieces are. And the degree to which we can use registry infrastructure to link all the stages of the total product life cycle, a registry fundamentally means you're using the same terms, the same definitions, the same data structure throughout the total product life cycle. This puts us forward. So I'm going to end with just sort of 3 examples of focus areas that MD EpiNet has engaged in that I think are very relevant to the way I read the draft of the planning board. Focus area 1 is just in leveraging existing data from claims and discharge summaries for device evaluation, research, and surveillance, just to look at how valuable is data that is routinely available if we were smart about accessing it, leveraging it. Focus area 2 is in infrastructure and international infrastructure and the development of consortia that allow everything from local to national registries of the identical device spaces to contribute information to one another. And there, the International Consortium of Orthopedic Registries, the International Consortium of Cardiac Registries, and the International Consortium of Vascular Registries are already underway through the MD EpiNet Infrastructure Center. And lastly is just looking at the themes around which methodologic improvements, and this is really the Harvard Center's focus, dealing with missing data, dealing with mixing data sources, dealing with in medical devices, not just the device, but the operator who puts it in, dealing with hierarchically structured data, understanding ultimately, putting all this together to understand benefit risk and accrue knowledge over a device life cycle. These are methodologic issues. Methodologies that also could help us very much understand how not to just go from pre-market to post-market, but how to bridge them so that as we build additional post-market data, we increase knowledge. So I'll end by saying that this has really been the focus of what MD EpiNet as a public-private partnership is concerted with, that the think tank incubator programs we run, and particularly in cardiovascular and orthopedics, but growing very quickly into other device areas, are focused on developing essentially an ecosystem-based learning laboratory to launch pilot projects that on the one hand have very specific, granular, disease-specific, device-specific questions to be answered, but simultaneously and by charter are also required to make sure that these are programs that give us much more generalizable principles of how to move forward, linking the pieces that we have, long-term and short-term, toward a system like the National Device System. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Rich?
Okay, thanks. So I have the real privilege of leading the FDA Sentinel system and being the PI of the Coordinating Center for PCORNet. And I see these as highly complementary activities that can contribute substantially to the topic of the day. And I'm delighted that Carmela and AHIP have been strong partners since the beginning of our work in Sentinel, and Joe is the leader of the PCORNet activity. So I'm glad that the three of us have an opportunity to offer perspectives. So I am convinced that the future will be terrific. I think our challenge is to work in the near.
That's tomorrow, right, Rich?
The tomorrow and how do we deal with tomorrow and next year? Partly because the only way we get to that wonderful future is through tomorrow and next year, but partly because there are questions that need to be answered right away. And I'd submit that through the activities, not only the ones that Mitch described, but through the work that Sentinel and PCORNet are doing, the glass is partially full. And as we say in New England, you can accomplish a lot with a partially inflated football.
You saw God's wrath with all the snow.
I'd say there really are three major areas in which I think the combination of Sentinel and PCORNet can make three important contributions. One is around post-marketing safety. The second is the harder challenge of assessing effectiveness. And then the third is creating the better capability to do randomized trials in the post-marketing setting. And those are all, I think, going to be essential because there are some issues around effectiveness that I think will only be answered by embedded, pragmatic trials that answer questions about how treatments, devices in this case, work in real-world settings with the people who are actually being treated. Several of our speakers, Lou and Clay, said the devil's in the details. So let me mention three details that have consumed a great deal of the time and energy of Sentinel and PCORNet. The first is the fact that as challenging as data issues are, the governance issues are probably more challenging. And so I think finding effective ways to address the governance topics is going to be an ongoing challenge. I think Sentinel has made great strides by finding what after the fact have proven to be perfectly obvious, simple governance rules, but it took us a long time to get there. The second is that although we are in a revolution with regard to the amount of data that is captured electronically as part of patient care, it isn't in its native form useful for the kinds of purposes we're talking about. So we're always going to have to address the issue of fitness for purpose. And I'd say both Sentinel and Pcornet have invested mightily in that topic of making routinely collected electronic health data useful to support FDA's needs or Pcornet's needs. And if you ask how large is that investment, it totals more than $250 million in the kinds of activities that I think are going to be critical for supporting device surveillance in the post-marketing setting. So I certainly subscribe to the idea that we should take advantage of the investments that have been made to support these additional activities. And then the third area that's in the devil in the details category is the one that Eric Flam just mentioned, which is the evidentiary standard is very high. It is higher for regulatory decision making than it is in normal academic environment. So the standard for the academic environment I live in is good enough to move the field forward, good enough to be the foundation for the next piece of research we do. It's usually not, can you regulate on it? And we've put a lot of thought and a lot of resources into making the quality of the data and the use of the data be good enough to support these activities. I'll say just parenthetically, there has appropriately been discussion about who will pay and to whom is it worth the investment to build out a device surveillance system. And it's way above my pay grade to say who should pay for it, but I'm convinced that the investment is well worth it. I think it's a no-brainer to say, as a society, it would be a big mistake to have an activity like this fail to progress because we can't agree how to support it, particularly if we take advantage of the very substantial investment that FDA and Pcornet have already made. Finally, I'll say I subscribe fully to the idea that we should there are some things we can just start doing now that will move us forward, even if we don't have a complete blueprint that's available. Pcornet and Sentinel are, even as we speak, engaged in a pretty deep discussion about what would it take to link data that originates either from clinical settings that Pcornet represents or from health plans, and to make them available in a bidirectional way to support inquiries that are of interest either to FDA or to Pcornet. That work is almost certainly the same work that is going to be needed for the kinds of linkage that we're talking about here, and so we ought to make sure that that work group performs its work in a way that supports these activities. I think there's a great opportunity. I thought that the pilot studies that are proposed in the document that's being released with this meeting were spot on. I think that the one that talks particularly about the opportunity for linking clinical registry data to data that Sentinel already has is it might not be low-hanging fruit, but relatively speaking, it's among the earliest things that we could undertake. And I think that it would make a lot of sense to start talking now about how we might do one of those kinds of linkage in the private health plan space to sort of understand what it would take and what we can do.
Great, thanks, Rich. Camarella?
So I'm pleased to be here today. I want to congratulate the Planning Board on a really interesting and thought-provoking report. And you're going to hear me repeat some of the issues. I should have let Joe go first, because the health plans are working both with Sentinel, as Rich has said, but is also doing a lot of work with Joe and Pcornet. and has been fully embracing comparative effectiveness research and the importance of comparative effectiveness research. Joe gets lists from our members all the time about the studies that they need to consider as they go forward because they see so many gaps in the marketplace of where there's not enough evidence. And health plans very much have been active participants, as Rich has said, in Sentinel and other post-marketing surveillance studies, because it's important to them to know the long-term of not only safety, but effectiveness. The evidentiary standard for coverage is high, I will be honest with you. I have this conversation with Jeff Sharon and his team all the time about both pharma and device manufacturers want to know why FDA approval is not just enough. Why can't it just translate into a coverage policy? And part of the challenge is because those devices or drugs have been done for specific trials on specific populations. And what happens once they get FDA approved? They get disseminated and used across populations that there were not studies for. So it's important to the health plans to know how the use of both drugs and devices in the post-marketing era for populations where they had not been studied or for populations that have multiple chronic conditions and a lot of complexities to them, are they still going to have the same effect, or are there other safety things? And there are publications replete with a number of unfortunate drug recalls we've had to do and device recalls we had to do because of things we've learned in the post-marketing era. And so, our members are going to embrace post-marketing surveillance, whether it's Sentinel or whether it's PCORnet in the work that we're going to start doing with them. The medical device surveillance system brings together multiple data sources and multiple stakeholders, which is going to be really important for its success. So it's administrative data, it's clinical data from EHRs and clinical registries, and I'm going to actually address the UDI question on claims in a few minutes. But if we look at the longitudinal information for specific populations on clinical registries, there was a great article in Health Affairs today on the transcatheter value therapy registry that just came out to show how you can use patient-reported data as well as procedure-level data to actually give additional information back to clinicians about this. So clinical registries are a really important piece that our members have embraced and our members report to. Sentinel, as Rich has said, has been very effective for assessing drugs, post-marketing surveillance. Many of our members have been engaged and more are getting engaged. We've been talking to Mark and his team about adding some additional drugs that I think we're about ready to move forward on. And our members continue to, whether it's Sentinel or the work they previously did in the Vaccine Safety Data Link project, are looking for ways to assess the long-term safety and effectiveness of drugs and devices. So in regard to UDI, the greatest value from our members would be to actually incorporate UDI in clinical data, such as registries and EHRs. And Joe's going to talk about PCORnet and the opportunities for device surveillance through electronic records and how our members are actually talking to them about how you blend, as Rich has said, administrative data with the PCORnet clinical data so that you get a much better picture. There's no doubt that there is a value for putting UDI on claims, but just having a field on the claim form for UDI does not make it so. The providers have a unique characteristic of pushing back and not wanting to report data that they don't think is necessary, and a UDI is not going to be necessary for reimbursement at this point in time. We're having problems right now with ICD-10 moving forward because many of the physicians do not want to incorporate ICD-10. So just putting a field on a claims form is not going to give us the data that we need. But using it in registries, using it on EHRs, showing the value of it, we may be able to move this forward. There's surely a clear opportunity. We see UDI as a promise for the future. It's going to actually provide more precise reporting on what works, what doesn't work, and hopefully help with some timely recalls. There needs to be standards so that things are compatible. As Mitch has said, we write the same language, we collect the data in the same way, we report out the data in the same way so that we can learn. And our members are eager to prioritize particularly those high-risk devices such as implantable devices. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Joe?
Well, you are going to see some overlap in comments between the three people right here who have actually cumulatively worked together for 30 years or so. But I will try to speak a little bit more directly from the PCORNet side. Start by just saying that I was very appreciative of the invitation to be here and very appreciative of the work that the Planning Committee did and of the vision that was laid out this morning. And what struck me is that everybody agrees with the vision, down to and including the fact that UDIs are essential. So everyone buys the vision, and there was some allusion to the barriers in the comments from here this morning. But there was a lot more conversation about it in the hallway. So people who've been working on it kind of see different parts of the gaps between the vision and reality. So it's going to be a slog. I think another thing that was very clearly noted this morning was that no single entity can do it by itself, neither financially nor politically from a governance point of view. So it's really going to take everybody at the table and all the resources that we've invested in. And with respect to devices, even many resources that weren't originally built to study devices can be marshaled. And PCORNet is one of those. And just to be crass for a minute, Rich preceded me a bit, but just PCORNet alone, PCORI has invested, or by September of 2015, PCORI will have invested $300 million plus in building PCORNet. So that's really a reflection of our Board of Governors' conviction that this infrastructure for doing comparative effectiveness research has to be rich, it has to be large, and it has to be really embedded in delivery systems. PCORNet has 11 clinical data research networks, large delivery systems, networks of delivery systems, each caring for at least 1 million persons, in total 26 million at this point, likely to be larger when phase 2 starts. It has 18 patient-powered research networks, active organizations of patients with single conditions who are professedly interested in being involved in research now. And they inject the essential element of patient-centeredness into PCORNet. PCORNet is, I like to say it's a second-generation data network. It builds on the shoulders of efforts like the HMO Research Network and Sentinel. It is, in contrast to those two, it is electronic health record driven. It is not claims driven. About 6 months into it, it became very apparent that those who have access to electronic health records data don't have access to claims data. So I want to be here in case anybody misses the point that it takes both clinical data from electronic health records and claims data to create a cohort, to even have denominators, to even know who you're studying. And so that's essential. We are working hard both with Sentinel and with the FDA on identifying ways to link and work PCORNet and Sentinel together. PCORNet bringing very rich clinical data, Sentinel providing claims data on some of those patients who are cared for in the CDRN and PPRN sites. PCORI is also working closely with AHIP because there are other health plans. And more than that, we are trying, and this is the second characteristic, we are aiming for a system that actually engages the key stakeholders. The mantra that there has to be something in this for everyone has been mentioned 3, 4, 5 times. We started off with that in mind, and we need to involve health plans, delivery system leaders, clinicians, and patients. And maybe the most difficult group are the clinicians, actually. They're the sort of the most isolated in some ways. The third way, so we're working with AHIP, in fact, to bring about this involvement of health plan leaders, along with the CDRNs who bring the delivery system leaders. We envision a time when system leaders and health plan leaders will sit down together to tackle these governance issues and to identify research questions that they are jointly interested in seeing conducted, studies that are of enough interest to them that in fact they will support the conduct of those studies and the data sharing that's needed. The third is that PCORNet is the first national data network to be really aiming to support both embedded clinical trials, post-marketing clinical trials, perhaps even someday pre-approval trials, but certainly in the beginning, post-market effectiveness trials, and large observational studies. So if we're building a large resource, we believe it needs to be useful for both purposes. Synergy, as I've mentioned, is essentially bringing all the resources we have into play. Sentinel and PCORnet have actually established a working group that meets weekly to begin discussing the technicalities of how we could do data exchange. The CTSAs, NIH-funded, NCATS overseen academic center-based clinical research networks that are very interested in speeding up and making more efficient clinical trials are a partner with us, and we work closely with them. We actually overlap with them remarkably. I have to say a word about registries. If PCORnet is one thing, it's miles wide and inches deep. It has the data in non-standardized form from the electronic health record. Registries, by their nature, aim to get detailed data. There is a perfect marriage between a large national resource like PCORnet, possibly linked with Sentinel and with other health plan data, and registries that have that more detailed data. Registries will never have the comparator populations, for example, that are sitting right there in the broader data. So a lot of opportunities to link with registries. Challenges, governance. I just want to say one thing. We need to get delivery systems, health plans, their clinicians and patients talking together. We totally subscribe to the notion that there has to be something in it for everyone, and we keenly believe that by putting the patient at the center and by asking everyone to speak directly to what does the patient need to know in this area is a secret sauce for getting a different kind of conversation going. I just have to say very quickly, methods are methods. If we really want this kind of research to change practice, to reach evidentiary standards, we have a continuous focus on methods. And finally, learning health system is where we'd all like to be. There's a big challenge in getting, I think, systems to think of the learning health system as something that compares to devices or a device to medical therapy. Right now, it's more, how do I make my system perform more efficiently? So there's both a challenge and room for conversation there about what a learning health system means to the different players that we've mentioned. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Joe. Sally?
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and participate today. I also want to congratulate the Planning Board. You have a wonderfully articulate document that I think is well put together. And I, like Alan, actually have some pages noted in my notes after having reviewed it that are quite specific to patient value, patient engagement, and very much the focus on patient centricity. So again, kudos to the group. Let me start by saying, for those of you who are a little unfamiliar with patients like me, I'm not here to represent our 300,000 members who today are adding data on over 2,300 different conditions. Someone's adding a bit of data every moment of the day, and we're now amassing 25 million structured data points on the site. So I'm not here to speak for them because I didn't have time to go to them and say, here's the report, what do you think? We do that, however, with the patient-focused drug development meetings that are held on the 20 conditions that FDA is holding for CEDAR, and we actually provide very systematically collected data on the very questions FDA is interested in getting answers to and bring that into the public document. I will certainly follow up with this document after we're done and then get that into our community and try to get some input as well. But I think what I can do is offer you 3 reflections on areas that I think are of importance here that will give you, I think, a sense of where we at Patients Like Me might look at a document like this and then think about how do we begin. So the first would be to take the report in context to our core values at Patients Like Me. The second, I'm going to give you a personal anecdote as well. I think it's always important to get that perspective. And then a path forward on the pilots that have been proposed. And I think we have some really wonderful opportunities to harness non-traditional, agile, innovative companies such as Patients Like Me in ways that haven't been harnessed before. So first, the first core value Patients Like Me has is patients first. So clearly the document in its mission statement has not only put patients first, it's actually the only stakeholder named in the mission statement. So I think that's actually quite significant. However, I would add one more word. I find words to be quite powerful. And what I found here was that by leveraging the experiences of patients to inform the decisions about medical device safety, very important. But I think what's missing is the word leveraging the experiences and the participation of patients so that they're really feeling more included and inclusive in the entire experience. Other values that we actually hold quite dear have to do with openness. So really thinking about not only do we need to capture data and do it well, but we also need to figure out ways of giving that data back to the original data users and ultimately to the end user of that particular device, and be sure that we have a way of being able to do that in a way that's understood. We need to be thinking about transparency, and I think it came up this morning with the notion of how do we protect people's privacy and confidentiality. This conversation is taking place at meetings I go to all the time. Let's learn from each other and collaborate on how to answer those questions. But first and foremost, let's be honest. We cannot assure privacy across the entire systems of a national data set without the actual risk of potential hacking that we don't have control over. What we can do is assure people we will protect them to the highest degree possible, and we will hold all of the data holders and the data partners to those high degrees and standards. Ultimately, with that said, another core value of ours is ensuring trust. We feel that without trust of our patient members, we wouldn't have a company at all. So one of the things that's very important for our patients is that we don't surprise them. They know what we're doing. They know what we're working on in terms of trying to answer important questions that matter to them. And I think in order for a national surveillance system of any sort to have the trust of the public of America, we have to figure out ways of ensuring that trust every step along the way. One way will be engaging them very proactively as participants and not simply as being placed at the center. Finally, our last core value, and one that we all take quite seriously, is actually part of each of our job descriptions, is create wow. And that I think this document can do. Let's be bold, let's be audacious, let's get beyond the patient centricity and intentionally start calling out patients as partners. Not just partners in this whole system, but as data partners, sources of data, and that we can start to create that in ways that we haven't done before. Building upon existing systems, I think, is critically important, and we would support that absolutely. I think the personal story I want to share with you is my family member of mine had a MI a couple of years ago. Wonderful care, received 2 stents, most recently had an injury to his wrist and needed to have an MRI. He has carried his little card about his stents in his wallet all along, and when he went to go see whether there was any concern about having an MRI with this associated with it, the instructions were that there wouldn't be too much worry so long as the field strengths were 1.5 Tesla and 3 Tesla. The static magnetic field gradient of less than 900 Gauss per centimeter, extrapolated of course, was all important information that needed to be considered. So obviously not a patient-centric document by any means, and something that we do need to be thinking about. If we're going to give patients these and say, hold it in your wallet, we should at the very least help them understand what it's for and why it might be useful at some point in time. It was very clear that he needed to check with someone about an MRI, but it wasn't totally clear what that was about. The other was in handwriting, it tells where those stents are with abbreviations, not with a description at all. So for your information, he has one at the PDA and the RCA. Now, I happen to know what those are, but does my family member? No. We can do better. So finally, I think what I'd like to then call for is the opportunity for us to think about innovation in the pilots. Pilot number 3 is a wonderful opportunity for working with a company that's innovative, agile, and ready to go. We have a patient-facing research platform already built. We've invested a lot of time, 10 years of work into this, and we have patients who are engaged and ready and want to be a participant with this. So I would call upon us to look at the non-traditional players. Look beyond the usual suspects. We feel that we're very much in parallel and complementary to PCORnet, and we love the opportunity to work with many of their partners on a regular basis on a variety of different projects. But what we see here is an opportunity to go beyond that. Let's think about what we can do in a patient-powered research network that's actually divorced in some ways from the traditional system, and see if we can't harness that data in a slightly different way using methods that we haven't even thought about or tested yet. We're actually actively working with the FDA right now on thinking about ways of being able to have them better understand our data. We're hoping to have a research collaboration agreement in place with them in the coming month or so, where we'll actually sit down with them and teach them about this data and help them understand how they can use it beyond the individual case report. Let's think more broadly. Let's start to think about this data as a rich source. So we can test data capture methods. We can use design science, which is what we are actually quite skilled at, in thinking about what are the user-centric ways of collecting data. Why not gather data that we really need and not data just in case we might need it? And that's not necessarily a patient-centric approach. So being clear that we have the opportunity to start thinking about creating and filling the gap for patient-reported outcome measures in an environment such as Patients Like Me. We have an open research exchange platform that was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in order to develop patient-reported outcome measures within the platform using concept elicitation all the way through to validation. So we have the platform there. We're ready to go. We're ready to have challenges from the industry, not only drug, but as well devices, to help us think about getting beyond the generic PROs that we typically are using and think more about the nuanced condition-specific and device-specific, because we heard already there are some very specific issues that we need to think about. Consider innovative post-market opportunities similar to what we've recently done in the idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis area that had 2 brand new drugs just recently approved last fall for this really devastating condition. We happen to have about 3,000 members actively engaging with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. We actually contributed a lot of their insights to the patient-focused drug development meeting that was held in the fall. But what we did with them is we created a launch monitor so that at the moment those drugs went to market, we actually had questions and a survey process already set up so that patients could tell us about their access issues, they could tell us about their early experiences with the drug, what were the side effects that they were starting to experience, and really start to gather some very proactive information from the insights of real people with comorbid conditions, with other kinds of experiences outside of the clinical trial population that could actually inform us about some of this information much more rapidly and more agilely. And then finally, I'd really like to press on this issue of considering patients as true data partners. They should have the same opportunities, incentives, as well as responsibilities and roles as any other data partner in this system. And when we do that, we actually give them credibility that their data matters enough for us to see them alongside other data partners. So I would call upon us to think about that and actually would challenge that in each pilot, there should be an opportunity for patients as data partners, so that not just the third one that I'm speaking about, which I think is well suited to patients like me and other collaborators, but I think overall it would be important. And lastly, let me say how pleased I am with the notion that we've talked about a learning health system. One of the things that has troubled me over the last number of years, first of all as a clinician, but then also now as an innovator in Patients Like Me, is that we have actually fallen to default too often on the triple aim, which actually is not patient-centric. It's really provider-centric. The learning health system is completely patient-centric, but I can tell you now, unless we find ways of creating environments for patients to be full, invited, and welcomed partners, we won't achieve the promise of a learning health system. So I call upon us to take that seriously, to see this as an opportunity that we have unprecedented before. We have not had an engaged public the way we have. We haven't engaged everyone yet. We still have ways to think about how to do that. And I think Alan raised that this morning with people who might not be as connected. But this digital divide is closing. It's getting smaller and smaller all the time. And we have opportunities now to test new methods and new ideas. And I welcome the opportunity to work with the Planning Board as well as FDA and Brookings on any ways that Patients Like Me can assist in that. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Sally. And thanks to all the panelists, just such terrific comments. Before we turn to the audience for some questions, I do have a couple pointed questions to all of you. And I think all of you brought up the specific pilots that were proposed in Chapter 4, and we heard on earlier sessions this morning the importance of doing something early, doing something relatively soon to start generating value on participation and motivating that long-term sustainability. In case you all haven't had a chance to look at the pilots, just very briefly, one was designed to ask questions around standardized ways of collecting UDIs across multiple hospital systems and linking those UDIs to important long-term outcomes, either through linking to Sentinel or to long-term outcomes registries. A second pilot was around identifying a small core set of clinical data elements that could either be informed by EHRs or by claims data, a core set of clinical elements that could form perhaps a common data model that multiple health systems or payers could routinely collect that could form the basis of a surveillance system in terms of its content. And then finally, identifying feasible ways to include patients' perspective, not just patient outcomes and patient-generated data, although that will be an important part of the system, but also including patients into the governance and into the participating in the system. So the other thing that we heard is that while these pilots are important, it's also important to make sure that as we do these pilots that we do answer those technical questions, but we also do so in a way that motivates participation, that we can see some early value by payers participating in these pilots or by patients participating in these pilots. So now come my questions. So to Rich, I'm going to pull you out first because you specifically said, and this very much helps me, some things we should just start doing now. And so I'd like to ask if you can expand upon that a little bit now in terms of Sentinel. How can we get some meaningful device surveillance within that system in the short term?
Well, for the Sentinel brings good information on essentially all medically attended care. And so it seems to me that what it can contribute is high quality information about certain kinds of outcomes that would be of interest. What we need to do is marry that to information about the exposures that we care about, and for the moment, the best way to do that is likely to be from registry data. So then the question is, how do you put them together? And I'd say the 60-second version is, first you have to think through sort of the technical piece of how an organization that has data that either comes from an EHR or from a registry, for the moment let's talk about a registry, identifies those individuals in the Sentinel data set. Our work group is talking about that. What's it take to identify the people in common? It's pretty clear that each of the Sentinel data partners would tackle that in a slightly different way. Part of the white paper we're developing is going to sort of lay those out so that we can develop a statement of principles about it. Then you have to ask, how much data would you have to transfer to do meaningful kinds of follow-up? And it's pretty clear that the more data that gets transferred, the more complicated it is, both to protect that information and also to get buy-in from both parties that this is information they want to transfer. So we're thinking about sort of a graded way of doing this. It might be enough, for instance, if the simplest question is, what is the rate of device failure, or what is the rate of rehospitalization for this condition? It might be enough to say, in these periods of time, how many individuals in this registry population were rehospitalized, had revision, without necessarily transferring a lot of data. You could say we'd want to do more than that and put together a complete linked data set. It's a higher level of effort that would let us then ask a larger set of questions. So that's the general drill, and I think we could start that. We could really start that now. The foundation, these issues of how do you do these things, are ones that Sentinel and PCORnet are wrestling with right now, and I think they apply directly. And if there's a willing partner who has the kind of device exposure information that would make this real, I think we could talk about that as an early sort of worked example. Okay?
So I guess and all of you could chime in on this one, but particularly maybe Carmela and Sally, is thinking across all the potential uses of the system. What, could be just safety, but and we heard from multiple panels, including the planning board, that this is a system much more than just safety and could support innovation, could support further characterizing the benefits and risks of a potential product. So thinking about these early pilots, how can we sort of engage payers and engage patients in a way that could generate more additional momentum and motivation to continuing the longer term build of the system?
So the health plans, and clearly Joe knows this because, as I said, we send him lists all the time, have really identified where there are gaps in evidence and where they need new information. And so I think, part of the conversation that Joe had talked about this new partnership we've established with the plans is to look at where they see the gaps in this evidence, and are there registries or other sources of data where we can start and fill in gaps without doing, a very expensive long-term trial, which will take us forever. I also want to make a plea for building on the systems that we have, Sentinel and PCORnet, as opposed to building something anew, to start doing this. I think we've got systems that are in place that have gone through the growing pains of people learning how to work together and come up with common standards and governance and definitions, and I think we need. And I'll give you one important example of, since Rich brought up registries, that I think brings very much in the patient perspective. There are several different joint replacement registries out there right now, and they're all working to try to come together to actually merge into one registry within the United States so that we don't have all these different. But I'm going to speak specifically about Kaiser's joint registry that was set up several years ago, and actually does have patient-reported outcomes into the joint registry. And they were actually able to focus on which devices over a 2 and 3 year period were most effective, had less problems, had less complications, resulted in exactly what Rich was talking about, less hospitalizations, less return to surgery, which they, because they're a delivery system as well as an insurer, led to making decisions about what devices they were going to use in the hospital for orthopedic surgery. And I think that's the power of everything that we're talking about. If there is information out there, how do we harness that and broaden those longitudinal studies? They went as much as to ask consumers about functional status and, how quickly their functional status improved in different areas, how quickly they returned to work, what their perceptions were relative to the experience. All of that is the valuable information that I think we can contribute. So I think there are examples out there, and we have to figure out a way to harness all of that information into something more of a larger longitudinal study.
Great, thanks. Sally, anything
Yeah,
to add?
thank you. Wonderful comments, and I think I would just add to that, in that when you're thinking also from the patient perspective, a lot of the opportunity that we've provided within the Patients Like Me platform is a longitudinal perspective. That's really about what it's like to live 24/7, 365 days a year with whatever it is you have, and with whatever it is you have that might also include a device somewhere in the mix. So I think the opportunity is as a novel data source within which we have data that's not quite what you're used to. We've actually spent a lot of time and investment in thinking about how do we take our data and transform that data in the common data models appropriate for an end user. So we've been able to map that to the appropriate ones. We can map it to PCORNet, we can map it to the OMOP experiment, we can map it to different places by going through the transformation model, recognizing that we couldn't come up with one common data model because we were such a diverse environment. So our hope would be that we get the opportunity to experiment and start to test how can some of the data that we've collected, and we've actually already gone to ICD-10 because we are agile and innovative enough to be able to do that quickly, but we can map it to ICD-9 if we need to. But it's that sort of thing. It's an environment within which if you intentionally invite people to engage in some things that they haven't been invited to engage in before, you'd be surprised at how many will say, yeah, I'm in for that. But you have to give them the experience in such a way that's meaningful to them, gives them something back and useful, and ultimately, at the end of the day, they can see that their participation had some real contribution. So.
Thanks, Sally. And Joe, any comments to add to the sort of, I know Pilot 3 came up a lot around what can we do to start engaging patients, or at least patient data, into meaningful device evidence development. And I know your system is building, and you will have the opportunity to bring in a lot of that important data. So any next steps? It's
certainly a goal and the intent of PCORNet to integrate patient data, and particularly to look for situations where collecting patient data also has utility from a clinical point of view, so that the systems ultimately buy off on the value of it. The other thing I just wanted to comment on, so yes, without a doubt, and in devices, I think we were discussing this at lunch, in devices more than a number of other areas, I would say, patient-reported data might be the essential data for evaluating, and particularly in comparative effectiveness settings. But Carmela mentioned Kaiser Permanente, where I used to work, and it's just, in some ways, what we are looking for here is an integration of data. Like Kaiser Permanente enjoys. And the reason they enjoy it is because they're kind of aligned, everybody, whether you're a clinician or a health plan executive or the head of the medical organization or running the pharmacy, you're aligned. And so the secret sauce for us is to figure out those areas in which we can align, which will then facilitate more integration of data and the capacity to do patient-centered research.
So I'll pick on my first panelist last, and Mitch, you thought you were going to get off the hook, but MD EpiNet has been doing just a tremendous amount of work in the area of methods, how to better do device surveillance, how to better build registries. In fact, tomorrow is a MD EpiNet, the Smart Informatics Think Tank, which I think is a 2-day event. You will be talking about specific pilots that are designed around infrastructure, around methods. So maybe ask you to speak a little bit more on the overlap. The 3 pilots that were presented in this planning board report certainly overlap with building infrastructure and methods development. Can we say that we're off to a head start with MD EpiNet's pilots, and that there is a lot of momentum already in some of these pilot ideas that could sort of dovetail and promote the development of a system like the MDS?
So I do, Greg, and I'll be repetitious enough to agree with, I think, everybody that the pilots that the current document and the board have set out, I think, really put 3 very important and fundamental stakes in the ground. I guess I don't see them as 3 pilots so much as 3 portfolios, because frankly, within each of those, and as I said earlier, I think to really make this happen, we're going to have to recognize that there are levels of movement forward that are really the long-term right solutions, but they are going to move more slowly because they will require a greater level of coordination and consensus to move them. Before that happens, I think demonstrating smaller, quicker successes that clearly fit within the pilot umbrellas as a portfolio. That's frankly where I think MD EpiNet probably has some stakes in the ground that are very good fits to the what I would call portfolio of pilots that the planning board document proposes. So for instance, and I think having, again, worked for a guy for 27 years who is relentless about achieving the balance of complex collaborations, but relentless about the word balance, is as we have moved finally into sort of a patient-centered orientation, that doesn't mean that it's time to leave industry and manufacturers behind or other stakeholders behind. It means, and I really, the key term is partnered. It's not about shifting ownership from one stakeholder to another. It's about finding the real win-win and better, faster, less expensive devices, reaching the bedside faster, in a business model that is attractive to manufacturers, because that's where the genius of innovation actually starts. This is what all of us ultimately want to be, because everybody in this room, sooner or later, is the patient or somebody in our family. It doesn't matter what your profession is. We all go that route. So starting from that perspective, I think keeping the balance, a lot of what we're focused on is the degree to which currently existing efforts could illustrate some of what I think much more profound shifts in the landscape in a longer term can execute. And there, I think some of the MD EpiNet programs, we'll come back to programs that have been developed in orthopedics and cardiovascular and grow. But I see this as complementary. And what I love about the sort of structure of the planning board document is I take this as 3 kind of portfolio buckets, where some faster successes that show there's actually a very attractive business model, the data can be higher quality, the safety information can be more robust, because safety concerns are really the barrier to innovation, and the speed and cost of doing a trial can be far slower. The first registry-based randomized trial I have been involved with was a trial in women, and it was just a trial of whether we went through the wrist or the leg in doing a cath. This was a public health study. It wasn't a device trial other than it was an interventional study. We used a registry-based model. It was a prospective randomized trial. But the site coordinators who quickly appreciated that 2/3 of the work that they would traditionally need to do was already being done by the registry electronically populating those case report forms. This is the only study in 30 years of doing clinical research where we were ahead of our enrollment curve before we had activated 50% of our sites. This is a different way of doing business. So I think there are some smaller bites, some quicker successes that could complement the bigger movement. And again, going fast and going far, I think to me is at least the vision of what pursuing the national system looks like. And there, I think MD EpiNets in its construct is a good place to keep that balance.
Great, thank you. I'd like to go ahead and open it up to the audience for any questions. If you do have questions, raise your hand, and we've got a microphone in the audience. So Dale?
Thanks. So I wanted to just compare and contrast some things we heard in maybe the first panel and in this panel, then ask a question. In the first panel, there was a lot of emphasis there's emphasis by multiple people about the need to be agile, the need to recognize that technology is changing very fast, that what we can do today may not be, we can't even imagine what we'll be able to do tomorrow. And we shouldn't build ourselves into obsolescence. In this panel, what I'm hearing is we've made a $250 million investment in multiple systems. We have to leverage those systems, which, by the way, the board agreed on. But are we looking to really, if you will, house ourselves in these big investments? Or do we think in 2 or 3 years we could we could do something similar, not for $250 million, but do we have an X Prize where we could do it for $5 million? Do we have infrastructures in place? And how do we make sure we keep disintermediating these big investments and we get much more agile with innovation? So I'm kind of curious, where does a $250 million go? By the way, I build systems, and I know where it could go, but kind of interested to hear it. But where did it go? Where will it go? And where does a $250 million go in 5 or 10 years?
So thanks for the question. Probably the most immediate challenge, and the one that's occupied an inordinate amount of our time, given this investment, is for the first time really capturing data from the electronic health record and standardizing it, transforming it so that across 11 delivery systems, ultimately, hopefully many more, many millions of people, we will have standardized clinical data to match the relatively standardized claims data that we've had for a long time. I think the reason this should endure and be worth it is because this is not a single study, this is not a single purpose, this is not solely for devices, nor drug safety, nor CER. It ultimately is building a tissue, if you will, across the country that can be latched onto for any number of kinds of studies, pre-approval, post-approval, surveillance, safety, and CER. So I think if you didn't have an investment like this, you'd be doing that every time you set up some other system. You could find a $5 million system that could connect people, but could it gather all the other data that this infrastructure is set up to collect?
Well, technology evolves rapidly. I'm not.
Yeah. Oh, you just said the magic words. Yes. Yes.
Sorry.
I certainly, and Precori and its Board of Governors who's sitting there, Dr. Kuntz, does not intend to continue plowing that kind of infrastructure money into PecorNet over time. These are largely startup costs, and they are largely the costs of, number one, getting the electronic health record data in a standardized fashion. Number two, creating a culture of collaboration and a culture that allows not only the continued ongoing work on the data infrastructure and the collaboration, but also the capacity to change and to adapt to new technologies that come along. And the third big part of the investment is involving patients, involving clinicians, and involving systems leaders. So I think those are enduring foundational elements that one needs if you're going, technology is kind of beside the point when certain systems are saying this data is not going to be shared. So an infrastructure and a culture, a network that has the key players involved, I think can adapt the technologies as they come along. But we do think that research use is what's going to sustain the large bulk of a network like this long term, not continued $250 million investments every 5 years.
So I hear a little different spin on the question, and I hope I'm not missing the question, but it's certainly in a universe where the only standard is progressively accelerated change. This is cultural, this is technical, and certainly from a healthcare point of view, hopefully it's also therapeutic accelerated change. I said very briefly before, but I'll just repeat it because I think it's at the heart of at least my view of the question. We have to create in parallel with a system and a learning health system, an environment, a culture that supports that system through the ability to have ongoing dialogue about what is changing and how do we approach that change. So we heard very clearly a patient perspective is collect the data you really need. Okay, don't collect a lot of what if kind of data. Get the data you really need. On the other hand, as we all know all too well, with real innovation in medical devices, what we also get are surprises. So how do we deal with a surprise and its challenge to the system that isn't collecting or might not be collecting, or when do we start thinking about collecting, and where is the dialogue with the patients who are the source of these data about that balance of the data that we really need, that we know we need today. I don't want to digress into the no, we don't know, and what we don't know, we don't know, but that's actually the dynamic with medical device innovation and with data collection tools. Is it really EHR-based technology that's going to need to be the future, or is it iPhone-based technology with patients reporting? So I think the key is, even in the larger, farther reach of this national system, we have, to be successful, we have got to create a culture that goes with the system to continue to engage dialogue about what's changing, what's new, what's on the horizon, and to what degree is what we have built sufficient or potentially insufficient, and how do we go about that shift, again, as partners, real partners. And that, to me, is an ecosystem-oriented environment, and it doesn't come easily. We need to concentrate on it. It's got to be as active a creation as the system itself.
Okay.
Sure. This is a great question, Dale, by the way.
The systems that we're building for PCORnet and for Sentinel are future-ready in the sense that they will accommodate ICD-10, SNOMED, RX Norm, LOINC, when systems begin to use them. If we're trying to build a system that can answer questions for FDA or for PCORI or for society now, we got to deal with the information that systems are currently collecting, and it's remarkably diverse. So some say when you get out of dirty claims data into EHR data, things will be better, and I assure you, things will be worse. And partly that's because electronic health records are infinitely customizable. That's a feature when vendors market them to clinical systems, and it is a bug when you're trying to build a system that can integrate across organizations. Sentinel does work with EHR data. Just as a guess, how many different units of measure are there in the Sentinel data for glycosylated hemoglobin? You're right, 32. Now, none of those 32 is a problem for a clinician, so it serves the clinical purpose fine. But if you're actually trying to do analysis across that data, you have to make a substantial investment in making the data fit for purpose. And so when you ask, where does all that money go? A lot of it goes, for Sentinel, millions of dollars a year goes into quality checking data that was perfectly good for its original purpose, but unless you do the quality checking, you won't realize that Q2 of 2012 has just disappeared someplace, or that there was a change in the way, in the number of diagnoses that are captured in the enterprise data warehouse. And if you go from 5 diagnoses to 7 diagnoses, it changes all of your predictive modeling. So the money goes to a lot of things that when you're talking at the level of panel 1, you don't have to think about. If you're doing it foxhole by foxhole, it turns into an expensive, arduous procedure. And I agree with you. You don't want to try to standardize all the data. You have to be attentive to the data that's of most interest. So the future, as I say, the future will be terrific. But working now is expensive and time-consuming, because a lot of people have to be attentive to making the data suitable for the questions that are being asked.
I could prolong this, but let me just make 2 brief comments. As you all know, health plans pay a lot of money to PCORI. It was part of the mandate in ACA. And so they want to make sure that that money is being appropriately used and used for value. They will go to a certain point for an infrastructure to be built, but after that, they're not going to continue. There's going to be this loud noise that Joe knows he's going to hear at some time, that this is not about infrastructure building. This is about doing the research that we need to have to give us the information on gaps. But the infrastructure is needed, and so there's some tolerance right now for that. But just to echo what Rich and others have said, EHRs, I've been puzzled by this. They can't talk to each other. We have created silos of EHRs, and it is so frustrating. And claims, if you try to put claims together, I will tell you it is your worst nightmare, because of the way physicians code, because of the differentiation in benefit packages that either employers select or consumers select. And you don't know a lot of times, is it not ordered because it's in the benefit package or not in the benefit package, or was it not ordered? Was it missed? Was it a missed opportunity? We've got a long way to go to standardize data. And I think these both infrastructure pieces on Sentinel and ProcoreNet are hopefully going to get us there, that we invest in them and build off of them, as opposed to just creating new infrastructures.
So Sally, last word on this question.
Thank you. I just really want to call for collaboration. I feel like we have an opportunity to go on this parallel and complementary path, where innovators such as ourselves can innovate, and we can be agile, and we can test out new models and methods, but we can also learn from the structure and the attention that's being paid to the national infrastructure that's being put together. And I also would echo that we have also spent 10 years building our infrastructure and have built a lot of it on some of the traditional structures. So we have ICD, we have SNOMED, we have LINC. All of our data is coded to all of this. So the opportunity for us to collaborate and be on parallel paths and learn from each other in this learning health system is just unprecedented. And I think the opportunity, especially in the device world, really represents something where we can bring a whole new level of information and possibly uncover some surprises you wouldn't expect along the way, because of the novel way that patients tell us about their experiences. So,
great, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, down front.
I consider this project, in a sense, trust and quality accountability of data is the first condition that you want to make it meaningful sense, not just get the money from government, because the government maintain almost a frivolous purchase or frivolous leasing or frivolous everything from land to money or resources or appropriation. So if you want the government to give you money, this will make it work. I'm thinking just make it a project, but not really make it meaningful. So the government, you have to fix it first. And especially for a medical institution or financial institution, then make this transaction, everything is the wrong way, then you are not going to make it work, because the data will not be correct. The data will not be correct. And the patient's diagnosis will not be correct. And this happened from way back several decades ago until now, still the same thing. And it's not just the medical industry, but also almost every government agency. They all have a fraudulent maintenance of fraudulent data and fraudulent sale of data. So you just have to fix the system first. And it's very easy to fix the system. It's just people reluctant to do it. Like US government agency or maybe FDA, maybe congressional staff, they have internet, they have comment blog and things like that, but they will not really take public comments. And they will not allow the people to see the comments, and they will obstruct the comment. And they even terminate your email account. So the really meaningful suggestion by the people will not be there. So that's what I say. If we want to make it meaningful, let's fix the real system, not the way you mention a system. What I mean is the system of current society living.
Great, thanks. Good comment. So I do think that what our approach here is, some collaboration with government at the table, but also the private sector that really do have the expertise and experiences with building systems like this. And we can. One thing that I did hear from everyone on the panel was that collaboration is key. Both from the private sector and the public sector. Just to summarize also, the other things that really did come out of this discussion were, let's start with the pilots, feasible pilots that can begin to address some principles for moving further. Just start doing something now because we can and we have the capability of beginning to build this system. Also a theme that was pretty interesting is Sally, having patients, your point about treating a patient like a data partner is really an important point in the theme of participation in such a system. And I would like to end what I think is the quote of the day, which is a paraphrase of Mitch's quote, which is that collaboration will get us going further. And that's a common theme throughout this panel as well as other panels. So thank you for that. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists today. Thank you.
All right, while they're moving down, I don't have much to add after Greg's excellent summary and after the great comments from this last panel, as well as everyone else today. I do want to thank all of our panelists for their time and effort in this discussion. These are people who have been working hard on issues related to better evidence, to promote better health for a long time, and have found ways to make those efforts work well with some of these new opportunities around post-market medical device surveillance. So we have before us, as a result of that, a lot of opportunities to build on the momentum that you've heard about today to get to more effective use of medical devices, more efficient regulatory processes, and much more valuable innovation in medical devices through to the development of the medical device surveillance system. And Greg just paraphrased Mitch. I think the goal here is definitely not to go alone. That's not going to work, but also to move forward quickly on overcoming the challenges and fulfilling some of these tremendous opportunities. You heard from the panelists a lot of feedback already on this report. This is very important for moving forward effectively, for building on the momentum and opportunity here, for making sure that the ideas developed here fit into legislative processes, fit into a lot of activities going on throughout our healthcare system. There will be more opportunities for all of you here in the room and everybody who's joining us on the web to contribute to this discussion. The FDA will be publishing a Federal Register notice shortly about the report with instructions on how to provide comments. I understand there's a 2-month comment period for this report. I'd encourage you to, if you have some further ideas, suggestions on how to move forward, to get those in, and preferably in less than 2 months. Not just discussion about the long-term vision, but as you heard many of the commenters today focus on, what are the next steps to get there, highlighting perhaps some of the very important obstacles and barriers to effective progress on post-market device surveillance, but also opportunities and ideas for promising directions on overcoming those barriers. Not just the ideal long-term model, that's an important part of the report, but also ways in which pilots can create value, create opportunities to move towards that long-term vision right now. So a lot of things that that could be part of your comments. The report is really just about starting this process, but this is unquestionably not the end of the process. Maybe it's the end of the beginning on efforts to pull together a truly national, effective, valuable, and sustainable medical device surveillance system. But to get there, it is going to take continued collaboration, and we're going to continue to do all we can here at Brookings to facilitate that. I do want to thank the people on the staff here at Brookings that have made this event, the report, and hopefully the further progress building on the report possible. It includes Greg Daniel, who you just saw leading our work in this area, Pranav Arora, Saha Katarzai, Matt Longo, and Joanna Klatzman. And I just want to say a special thanks to Heather Colvin. This was a short time frame for the report. I can't tell you how many conversations I had with her and emails I had with her while she was worried about family getting in town for the holidays or picking up kids on the weekend, but still prioritize this along with all of those other activities. It's been a great team to work with and just a reflection of the commitment to the ideas and the great potential of this effort. So a real privilege to work with them, with FDA, and with all of you on this very important topic of medical device surveillance. So thank you all for attending. Thank you in advance for continuing contributions to achieving the goals that we've laid out here today, and we look forward to making that real progress as soon as possible. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.